let me start with an introduction of myself. I'm Henry Yu. I teach at the University of British Columbia, and I'm joining you from the campus of the University of British Columbia, which is on the unceded ancestral traditional territory of the Musqueam, the Hunkaminam-speaking peoples at the mouth of the river here in what is now called British Columbia. I want to thank, again, everybody. The first two panels, I think, have introduced an incredible array of different topics and thoughts and insights, and it's been an amazing set of conversations. We're looking forward to this third panel, and we know that we have some wonderful scholars who I'll just kind of go through right now, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order they're listed up there. So first, we are really honored to have Keith Camacho, professor and chair of the Department of Asian American Studies at UCLA, joining us. Professor Camacho received his PhD from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So he's our first, and just to give a heads up to Keith that actually we're going to ask you to actually be the first to roundtable start and sharing with the panel as well. We'll just go around in alphabetical order. I think is not a bad way. The next after Keith is Professor Aiko Day, who is the Elizabeth Small Professor of English and an affiliated faculty at the Department of Critical Race and Political Economy, and chair of Critical Social Thought in English at Mount Holyoke College. Professor Day received her PhD in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley. We have Professor John Price, who is emeritus professor and an adjunct, remaining as an adjunct still at the Department of History at the University of Victoria, or UVic. Professor Price received his PhD from the University of British Columbia. After that is Professor Dean Saranillo, who is an associate professor in political science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and received his PhD in American culture from Michigan. And then the final panelist, my colleague at UBC, Professor Sunera Thobani, who is a professor in the Department of Asian Studies and received her PhD originally from the Department of Sociology at Simon Fraser University. So we've got a lot of wonderful scholars to kind of start us off, and so I'm just going to pass it straight to Professor Camacho to sort of start us thinking and his sharing on his thoughts a century after 1923. So in some sense to not focus in the same way as the first two panels on the moment of the 1920s and 1923, but to begin to help us think about 2023 in the light of 1923. So Professor Camacho.
Henry, thank you, Henry, and Aiko, Sunera, Dean, John. Much props as well to Melanie, Naomi, Tak, Fujitani, and everybody on the back end putting together this event. I started out earlier on, and panels 1, 2 rocked the mic. And, Henry, you're too kind and generous, but it's not so much the thoughts I have to share, but it's the thoughts that some of the folks I've been working with have to share. And so Awafade greetings from Tavangar, otherwise known as LA. I kind of structured my thing like a talk because I have no organization right now. All I do is memos upon memos and memos. So yes, students, there's hope, but just don't become an administrator like me. So, okay, let me begin. So I want to talk about preliminary thoughts on Asian American and Pacific Islander solidarity in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I frame my roundtable talk / round comments around like this phrase or title: "You ain't gotta fit in." You ain't gotta fit in. Samoan and Asian solidarity in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the scholars Eric Tang and Lili Wang observe, quote, "The anti-Asian violence during the pandemic has forced many of us to question how we are truly viewed, who will stand with us and how we stand with others. They ask, what does racial solidarity mean right now? The practice of showing up, of making our presence meaningful is no simple matter. Beyond statements and hashtags, how do we actively and creatively practice solidarity? Through our activism, our art, redirecting material resources, and the narratives we shape, end quote. For our panel, looking back from 2023, I discuss how Samoans, a transnational Pacific Islander community, have been reshaping our notions of solidarity in the wake of the pandemic. Please know as well that this is a work in progress. There's a lot I'm trying to unpack and unthink here, and so it's really been helpful listening to panels 1 and 2. Otherwise, I thank Julianne, JP, Len, Pastor Pua, all these many folks for helping me to respectfully convey this history. Tolo, tolo lava. On May 14, 2021, I pulled up to the Long Beach Marina in my white Honda Civic. It was a bright and sunny day in California. Samoans, other Pacific Islanders, and Asian Americans all rolled up with their lowriders, their cars, their trucks, their SUVs, and their motorcycles. Much chatter and laughter filled the air, as did folks' hip hop and reggae music booming from their motorcycles and their vehicles. Art Medina, a Chamorro organizer at Cal State Long Beach and a good friend of mine, had also brought a portable electric generator, speaker, and mic for the event. And as folks gathered, about 20 plus poster boards were laid out across the lawn, each expressing unique English and Samoan language phrases in solidarity with Asian Americans. The organizers of the march, Fa'atasinga Uso, or the Gathering of Brothers, likewise encouraged folks to select any poster they liked and to pick them up, for this march. Fa'atasinga Uso, also known as the Fo movement, are formerly incarcerated Samoan original gangsters, or OGs, who historically represent different crews and cliques, but who now come together as one Aenga, or family. So the earlier panels around periodization, around dates, around geographic, temporal overlap, differences, distinctions, etc. I think what I'm trying to flesh out here with the assistance of these OGs are really broadly histories of the marginalized, histories of the incarcerated, histories of the punished, right? Histories of Indigenous and Asian folks. Reflecting on the origins, Fa'atasinga Uso, or the Fo, they state, quote, "We chose the streets over books, gangs over church. We found ourselves enmeshed in the gang lifestyle, and everything that is connected to it made us menaces to society. We committed crimes in support of our colors and gave years of our lives to the prison system. Today, we choose unity and lay down everything that separated us as Usos, or brothers. We are Usos of integrity and men of peace who look to God for guidance and purpose. We are men of passion who will stop at nothing until all of our neighborhoods are safe, every prison bed is empty, and every Samoan heart beats as one," end quote. So at this march, as I walked up to this march, it's May 2021. A lot of us remember those, really hard times, that this heavy anti-Asian hate happening. The pandemic, there was closures, public health closures. And I actually remember feeling very giddy, because this is like one of the few times I'm out in space now, even though there's all these restrictions happening in Canada, US, etc. Right? But I also know that was a very privileged position. I'm coming in as a teacher, academic, being able to work remotely, while the Fo brothers and sisters and all these many folks, Southeast Asian, Mexican Americans, were still putting their lives at great risk, even in May 2021. I want to remember that. There's a lot of people out there that are putting their lives at great risk as quote unquote essential workers. So all these things were happening. We also know, and it was kind of brought up indirectly earlier in the panels, all the anti-Asian violence in Indianapolis, the white supremacist shootings, Atlanta, and as well the national media's treatment of Asian Black conflict as stemming from Black individuals and not really taking stock of white supremacist violence broadly. And to complicate these matters further, there was even in California, Samoan and other Pacific Islander leaders pushing back against the Stop AAPI hate, Stop Asian American Islander hate. Specifically, a lot of these community organizations, grassroots orgs, were advocating for a greater disaggregation of Pacific Islanders from the Asian American census and racial categories. So I know Nayan, Shaw, a bunch of other folks really nicely talked about, how these categories come into being, the purposes they serve, the politics they take up, and the audiences they include and exclude, right? So these things are all happening and really making me think about solidarity, conflict, whatnot. And so given that context, given these fraught and sometimes productive context and conditions, why did Fa'ata sing Au Uso? Why did these original gangsters organize a protest march against anti-Asian hate? Why? Why did the foe organize, right? Not only within this little window called the pandemic, but in this broader genealogy, imperial genealogy, indigenous genealogy, etc., that tether not just these panels, but broadly empire and anti-empire. As we prepared to walk from the parking lot of Marina to a nearby housing that of the City Council of Long Beach, the leadership of the foe stepped up to the mic. Most of the foe wore clothes and hats that represented their favorite sports teams, as with the Lakers and the Raiders. A few folks even sported colors, red and blue, to represent Bloods and Crips respectively. But they all did so as unified OGs dedicated to public service. The foe also discussed how they renewed their faith in God in the inside, how they pursued educational and vocational opportunities on the inside, and how they reduced their sentences on the inside meaning in prison. They likewise reiterate an important point about solidarity that I had come across in my interviews with Samoan OGs, namely that Asians and Samoans had forged a community called the Others in the prisons of California, that they have forged a community calling themselves the Others in the prisons of California. As the fall revealed to me, prisons represent three major races or organizations: Blacks, Mexicans, and whites. Therefore, Cambodians, Chinese, Filipinos, Koreans, Samoans, Tongans, Vietnamese, and many other Asians and Pacific Islanders had to recalibrate their gang affiliations on the inside. As a result, many Asians and Samoans came together to protect each other from the larger and more powerful Black, Mexican, and white gangs. As one organizer of the protest march in Long Beach indicated, quote, the four were talking about how they wanted to do something toward this Stop Asian Hate. They're like, hey, we're going to stand up for the Asian brothers behind the walls, end quote. When I asked the organizer, the four had contacted the media, given that journalists seldom cover meaningful stories about Pacific Islanders, let alone former OGs, the organizer said, quote, no, we didn't reach out to the media. For us, it was all grassroots efforts. It was like, can we pull this off? We're like, yeah, hell yeah, why not? Then we connected with the Pacific Islander groups from the Bay Area, including Asian American groups like API Rise. API Rise are formerly incarcerated Asians and some Islanders who are doing a lot of social justice work today. So, our panel is looking back, right? Thinking back in 2023, right? One OG in response to that thinking back, and David made a really crucial point for a lot of Indigenous people in Oceania, that the thinking back is about also thinking forward and acting forward. One OG put it simply, quote, we just setting things up for our young ones, giving our young ones the information that they need to have, where we come from, and just be proud of who you are. You ain't gotta fit in, because we did all that already. We lost a bunch of lives already. There's brothers and sisters in prison right now because we set the tone for it. You ain't gotta go through that no more. Sedus Masi, Fafata Lava, and thank you. And that's just, again, my 7-8 minute spiel, trying to think of, specifically this one little march, but how those folks on the inside and outside are having us to kind of, in their terms and in their words, grapple with what solidarity, this reckoning of solidarity means today. Thanks.
Thanks, Keith, for getting us started and about thinking about sort of grassroots and solidarities and maybe picking up from previous conversations of getting away from thinking only through the settler state and what they think of people. I'm going to pass it over to Professor Day. You're next.
Thanks. Thank you, Melanie, Naomi, Henry, and Tak and everyone else kind of behind the scenes for organizing the roundtable. I'm really honored to be speaking to you from the traditional ancestral lands of the Nonotuck Nation in Western Massachusetts. It's been really interesting to me to reflect on the centennial of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, especially as it relates to the parallel arcs of anti-Asian policy in Canada and the United States since the late 19th century. So for the purposes of my remarks today, I'm especially interested in the way this anniversary coincides with the centennial of the US Supreme Court's 1923 ruling that upheld Washington state's alien land laws. So alien land laws were passed in the early 20th century to prevent primarily Chinese and Japanese from owning property, mostly in the Western states. So in my own work, I've been interested in examining these parallels as part of a broader expression of settler colonial capitalism. So I see them as a series of complementary border operations that facilitate and manage a settler colonial mode of production that relies on a racialized or disposable migrant labor system. So in this vein, I've looked at the ways that Asians come to represent a kind of a racialized embodiment of a destructive capitalism, whether they're cast as, cheap labor or whether they're cast as highly skilled, wealthy foreign investors. So in really general terms, and definitely following on the work of Colleen Lai, I've examined kind of the way that the stereotype of the yellow peril threat or how model minority discourse are really two sides of the same form of racialization in which economic efficiency is kind of used as the basis for exclusion or inclusion. So what I want to try to do today is to shift our way from thinking about a paradigm of exclusionary anti-Asian discrimination, and instead to consider what it would mean to move toward abolitionist and decolonial ways of thinking about about anti-Asian racism. So definitely following and inspired by some of the ways in which Keith is characterizing, Pacific Islander and Asian solidarity movements. So in the aftermath of the surge in anti-Asian racist violence during COVID-19, one of the things I want to think about is what would it mean for Asians to refuse the temptations of what Dylan Rodriguez calls compulsory liberalism, that sees anti-Asian violence primarily through a framework of exceptional harm caused by individual perpetrators. Okay, so in both Canada and the US, it has been tempting to see the end of anti-Asian immigration policy as a sign of greater Asian inclusion. But despite the repeal of exclusionary immigration legislation, the economic dimensions of racial exclusion have never really been redressed. We could recall that the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act in the US specifically barred laborers and exempted merchant classes. Canada's 1885 Chinese head tax aimed to deter poor Chinese migrants, and also the 1923 Chinese Immigration Act similarly included exceptions for merchant classes. So even after in 1965 and 1967 reforms to immigration, the population of undesirable Asian migrants has never really changed. Poor Asian migrants continue to constitute an alien threat to the security of white settler property, which I think the Fujian migrant crisis in 1999 really, exposed. So this is all to say that the paradigm of anti-Asian hate, which we've seen during the pandemic, really actually kind of it sort of trivializes in some ways the confluence of race, gender, and class that mediate a militarized border that continues to secure white settler futurity. So to give you a concrete example of what Moon Ho Jung has condemned as the pathetically provisional and not fundamentally transformative frame of liberal inclusion, I want to turn to ways that anti-Asian policy has been reanimated through the recent resurrection of alien land laws in the United States just like a few months ago. And as I mentioned earlier, alien land laws were passed 100 years ago to bar Asians who were ineligible for citizenship from buying property. So while most states that had these laws, removed them in the 50s and 60s, Florida was one of the last states to remove these laws, and not in the 60s or 70s, but actually as recently as 2018. So this last May, ironically, maybe during Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, Governor Ron DeSantis and the Florida legislature were busy resuscitating this long dead form of anti-Asian policy. And so as Beth Lou Williams has reported, under the guise of national security, Florida lawmakers unanimously passed SB 264 to prohibit the Chinese government from buying real estate. Because the bill uses really broad and vague language, the law could deny anyone holding Chinese citizenship from buying real estate in Florida, even if they're lawful permanent residents of the United States. So this would mean that all Florida buyers would have to provide affidavits attesting to the fact that they're not part of members of the prohibitive classes, as well as existing Chinese residents would have to complete a special registration if they're actually homeowners. So as Beth Lou Williams underscores, this universal requirement will encourage real estate agents, sellers, and the public to view all Asian Americans with suspicion. And although we often think of Florida as being sort of an outlier, it's definitely not in this case, because Montana, I think, has passed similar legislation, and Texas is also crafting this legislation as well. So we have been here before, literally. But what I want to emphasize is that the problem before us is deeper than Asian North Americans being viewed and treated as aliens, foreigners, traitors, or spies. One of the problems with this framing is that it breeds an assumption that if Asians can better demonstrate their Canadianness or Americanness, that they will be rewarded with the privileges of citizenship. I think to which Moon Ho Jung rightly questions, as if being allowed to join the nation will set us free. So in this return of alien land laws, we can see the strange convergence of both yellow parallelism and model minority discourse, where the model minority immigrant dreamer is now the yellow peril. Okay, so just to bring my remarks to a close, a decolonial abolitionist approach to anti-Asian racism can no longer depend on seeing the state as an agent of care, repair, justice, respect, or recognition. By refusing what Smaro Cambarelli describes as the sedative politics of liberal multiculturalism, we can refute the very terms of national cohesion. As Manu Karuka reminds us, from the perspective of Indigenous nations, there is no national territory of the United States or Canada. There are only colonized territories. There is no national US political economy, only an imperial one, which continues to be maintained not through the rule of law, contract, or competition, but simply through the renewal of colonial occupation. So this understanding might move us away from a view of the border as a site of exclusion or inclusion. Instead, we could see the border as a governing practice and method whose imperial reach has been exercised in the militarized laboratories of the settler Pacific. So to depersonalize anti-Asian racism and deprovincialize Asian North American spaces means that we can trace how the imperial infrastructures of what Jody Kim calls the settler garrison are deeply imbricated within US and Canadian settler colonial nation building. So following Keith Camacho's and Dean Serenilio's work, we can no longer regard the destructive obliterations of Asian and Pacific Islander worlds as isolated from Asian North American encounters with a militarized white supremacist domestic front. Thank you.
Thanks, Aiko, for that. And so again, picking up a lot of themes that in earlier panels about property and ownership and what's really going on in terms of exclusion, inclusion. So next, I'm going to pass it over to Professor Price. John.
Thanks so much, Henry, and thanks to all of the organizers. I'm so indebted to Tak and Melanie and Naomi and Jenny for organizing and moderating this symposium. I'm speaking from the traditional unceded territories of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And I'm really honored to be on this panel with such fabulous scholars, some of whom I know well. And I want to just relate from the beginning that 1923 is very pertinent to my own family story, as my grandparents stole Kwantlen land as part of the soldier settlement schemes that were imposed after World War I. And so that family story is, part of my story, as part of the education that I've had to go through. The re-education is coming to grips with that. I want to move to two issues to put out there for discussion. The two issues are looking at what the contemporary forms of exclusion are, and also raise a question of theory in relation to what we're discussing. So in terms of the contemporary form of exclusion, let me relate an incident when the Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou was released from detention in the fall of 2021, along with two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, who had been arrested by the Chinese authorities. Senator Yuen Pao-Wu tweeted that it was a happy day for the families of the Canadian men who had become known around the world as the two Michaels, and for Meng, who was simultaneously released and allowed to return to China. He cited in his tweet a former US ambassador, Chaz Freeman, saying that the US, quote, assisted by Canada, took Meng hostage in the first place as part of its trade and technology war with China. Chris Alexander, a former immigration minister in Stephen Harper's Conservative government, replied by tweeting, by claiming Meng was taken hostage, Yuen Pao-Wu has violated his oath as a Canadian senator and should resign. He continued, mouthpieces for foreign propaganda should have no place in Canada's parliament, he added. I cite this as an example of modern exclusion. I think we're seeing in Canada what Muhon has introduced in the previous panel, that is a type of loyalty test to determine who are the good Asians and who are the bad Asians, a public inquiry on foreign interference, a registry for so-called foreign agents, intense security screening of research, particularly by Chinese-Canadian researcher. Are all these not new instruments of modern or liberal exclusion? And if so, how do we understand them? How do we deal with them? On the question of theory, let me go back to the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act. As part of a team that produced a booklet, 1923, Challenging Racism's Past and Present, we tried to find the origins of the campaign that led to the Exclusion Act in 1923. What we found was that the movement originated and was propelled out of British Columbia, not in Ottawa, not by the federal government or federal authorities. It came out of British Columbia because of the increasingly important role that Asian Canadians were playing in the economy during World War I. Asian Canadians represented 20% of the industrial workforce. Chinese and Japanese Canadian farmers were major players in producing and marketing fruits and vegetables. Japanese Canadian fishers were major players in that industry. Chinese Canadian workers and South Asian workers were forming unions and leading strikes. These activities, the capabilities, the agency demonstrated by Asian Canadians led the forces of white supremacy to regroup and initiate an anti-Asian campaign after World War I that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. But what they were demanding at the moment was Asian exclusion, not Chinese exclusion. That discussion, why it ended up as Chinese exclusion, may be something we want to discuss. Just to illustrate the determination on the part of the forces of white supremacy, the United Farmers of British Columbia and BC Fruit Growers Association mobilized, asserting that land ownership of BC by Japanese and Chinese is continually increasing and constitutes a peril to our ideal of a white British Columbia, as it is impossible for Japanese and Chinese to become assimilated as Canadian citizens. The Vancouver Board of Trade also lobbied for restricted land ownership and a ban on immigration. The Victoria Chamber of Commerce created a committee on Oriental aggression that demanded a ban on Asian immigration and segregation of schools. Closely examining the nature of this backlash reveals the material basis of the campaign for exclusion. That is the re-securing of land and markets for white settlers and businesses. So I wonder if critical anti-racist studies doesn't need some enriching to look at the material basis for everything that's going on. A couple of years ago, reviewers of another booklet that I helped to produce with Asian, Canadian, and Indigenous scholars, Challenging Racist British Columbia 150 Years and Counting, brought to my attention the theory of racial capitalism as articulated by the scholar Cedric J. Robinson. Having checked it out, it really does seem relevant and potentially a powerful tool, as it obliges us to look not only at racisms, but also at the material circumstances that produce race. This resonates with much of what is coming out of Indigenous and settler colonial studies. As my colleague Nick Claxton impressed upon me many times, it's all about the land. When Europeans arrived on Turtle Island, they dispossessed Native people, not because they were bad people, it was because they wanted the land, they wanted the resources, and they were imbued with the belief in European superiority. So those are the questions that I have, the issues I wanted to raise. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. A great, I think, segue over to Professor Serenilio of the University of Hawaii. Dean.
Thank you. I'll echo all of the thank yous that the previous panelists shared. We're collectively gathered to think about the impact of 1923, and this session in particular examines 2023. And as a person speaking from Hawaii, and as a person who is also from the island of Maui, I wonder what a commemoration of the wildfires in Lahaina 100 years from now will look like. Whether Lahaina will be rebuilt with water traveling to feed Kaua'ula Valley, to flow further to the traditional wetlands of Lahaina that also fed its people. Naomi Klein and Kupoala Sproat argued recently, quote, irreplaceable historical and cultural artifacts have been lost to the flames, but not the teachings that those artifacts represent. Native Hawaiians know what their rights are to stay on their ancestral lands, to restore stream flows to those lands, and to ensure their indigenous livelihoods will persevere in the face of a climate crisis fueled by colonial pillage. And so we live in a time of disaster. For the most recent devastating fires on Maui and Hawaii Island, lethal heat waves throughout the world, flooding, typhoons, and hurricanes throughout Asia and Oceania, water contamination at Kapukaki, Red Hill, and global COVID pandemic, disaster can no longer be understood as a singular event, but has become our steady state. Yet these disasters all share common origins in our global economic system. Global capitalism, as has been argued by different scholars, cannot be understood without situating its emergence and reliance on various genealogies of accumulation by dispossession, racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, settler colonialism, imperialism, and empire. And this continuity of crises tell us that the fail-forward pattern of settler colonialism and capitalism has hit a limit, even as arguments for the colonization of other planets proliferate. This calls for a critical engagement with the past and present as a means to produce alternative futures to the settler state. It means to understand economic crises as an abstraction that makes the primacy of the ecological crisis seemingly secondary. Such alternative futures are critically important as we are living in a moment when a refusal of settler governance is a refusal of climate change, as Native movements and Indigenous sovereignty are often at the front lines, blocking extractive industries. And so evasive abstractions have long set the ideological conditions for capitalism and its accompanying environmental degradation via ongoing forms of primitive accumulation, divorcing Native peoples from the means of production and the, quote, material conditions of resistance, and its seemingly permanent structure, a kind of a settler accumulation by Native dispossession. As Noenua Silva and Jonathan Goldberg-Killer point out, a key difference between Western and Indigenous notions of sovereignty is that Indigenous epistemologies describe the human and non-human divide not as a binary, but rather as interdependent familial relations. As such, the United States has often sought to make Native peoples vulnerable by disrupting those familial relations to the elimination of one or more sets of human to non-human relations. This is a tactic of Native dispossession, whether it's targeting Kalo or Tarawa in Hawaii through water expropriation, the US Army's elimination of the buffalo, numbering 15 million in 1871. I think the numbers upon settlement were somewhere between 30 million and 60 million. But by 1903, the number of the buffalo was reduced to 34. The genetic modification of corn, wild rice, taro, and salmon in the Pacific Northwest, or military tactics that target the elimination of food sources and ecosystems, as was done in the Philippine-American War, Korean War, Vietnam War, and numerous others, making use of herbicides such as Agent Orange. So our present moment is the afterlife of this future wish. which has targeted non-humans for elimination to make the material conditions of resistance impossible, to literally produce so-called domestic dependent nations or underdeveloped nations. And the death of these non-human relations is a continual birth and rebirth of capitalism, the particular mode of production that has evolved to set the current environmental conditions of climate crisis. And given this, the renewal and protection of native relationality to non-humans and land can move us toward a more sustainable, healthy, and equitable system for all currently vulnerable that can ever be imagined in this current system. So many indigenous movements aim to cultivate non-capitalist relations and plant the seeds for indigenous economies to reemerge by imagining ways to use settler colonialism against itself, where Haunani-Ke Trust begins by revealing the forms of knowledge and subjectivity, specifically liberalism and the Democratic Party, that uphold Asian settler colonialism in Hawaii. The work of Noelani Goodyear Kaupua builds on Trask and marks a turn in this field by offering a plurality of possibilities that might emerge when diverse settler groups work in place-based affinity with Kanaka Uiwi. Goodyear Kaupua illustrates in her first book, The Seeds We Planted, just how Native movements and educational work address current problems. By rebuilding Hawaiian governance, foodways, and economies, they create and imagine alternative power relations to settler colonialism. Quote, the marginalization and suppression of indigenous knowledges has gone hand in hand with the transformation and degradation of indigenous economic systems and the ecosystems that nourish us. Conversely, settler colonial relations might be transformed by rebuilding in new ways the indigenous structures that have historically sustained our societies. So Goodyear Kaupua's work aims for non-statist forms of deoccupation, which help cultivate mutual respect by setting the conditions of possibility to be determined by the land, urgently critical in a moment of ecological crisis. Candice Fujikane, through community and activist work, has theorized the term settler ally to be capacious as opening ways of being in Hawaii that co-resist settler colonialism and occupation. And I know there's a critique against the use of the word ally. I just want to say that I think my sense of the conversation is pinpointing a specific word as a kind of sign, but losing sight of the structure that term is critiquing and imagining. So instead of just arguing over a word, I think we need to also think about what structure that word is responding to or describing. And so Fujikane says the term, quote, settler roots us in the settler colonialism that we seek to re-articulate so that we never lose sight of those conditions or our own positionality or the privileges we derive from it. At the same time, however, the term encompasses the imaginative possibilities for collaborative work on ea, or sovereignty, life, breath, and land-based decolonial nation building, for there's joy too in these practices of growing ea. So as the work of these scholars and activists illuminates, when we recognize that empire relies on imperialist expansion to respond to the failures of capitalism, we can also identify such problems as possibilities for replacement. Placing Asian diaspora and Native histories together opens new lines of inquiry, allowing for their different historical and geopolitical forms of oppression to be understood as interdependent in ways that produce possibilities outside of the constrained logics of US empire. Asian diaspora studies and Native studies thus offer relational ways to analyze an important assemblage of US empire, where diaspora and indigeneity, settler colonialism, US imperialism geopolitically convened. Understanding that power does not simply target historically oppressed communities, but also operates through their practices, ambitions, narratives, and silences, offers a way to examine other dynamics of power, labor exploitation, anti-immigrant laws and sentiment, imperialist wars, which have all shaped Asian groups without misrecognizing the context for framing an Asian diaspora on native land seized by the US settler state. And so Asian diaspora and Kanaka Uiwi histories have the potential to be transformative when assembled intersectionally, and can be done without diminishing the complexities of each. This signals a need, as articulation theory argues, for an attempt to situate these different histories in complex unity, not flattening difference and assuming these groups are in solidarity, nor falling to the pitfalls of difference and framing them as always in opposition. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. Professor Thavani.
Thank you very much. I too would like to thank all of the organizers of this event. Thank my co-panelists and also the earlier two panels. It's been a really very, very productive discussion, and I'm just really very pleased to be part of this. I would like to also say that I am coming to you from Coast Salish territories. I work at UBC, which is on Musqueam territories. And of course, these territories are being contested. The issue of indigenous sovereignty has already been brought up. But I think it's really important to tie it to acknowledgement of land, that the when we acknowledge the land, to acknowledge the kind of contestations for sovereignty that are ongoing in our very sites of working and living. So when I think of 2023 in the context of 1923, it's very important to recognize that we're living through a moment of profound change, profound transformation. We're dealing with any number of catastrophes. The climate emergency has certainly been mentioned, and that's crucial. The explosion of white supremacy, the rise of authoritarianism, fascism, mass movements now taking place all around the world. We are hearing stories every day of the number of migrants drowning in the Mediterranean. This is really a kind of moment of profound change that is taking place. I see it as bringing an end to the international order that has been in place since the Second World War. Where these changes are taking us, where we will eventually end up, is not clear at all. But what is clear is that profound changes are taking place. And so when I think about 1923, what becomes really important to understand for me is what was the structure of the order that was coming in through these policies and through related policies, which have already been mentioned by earlier panelists. What was the structure of the nation that was coming into being? What was the nature of the state that was coming into being through these policies? So what I want to flag here is that neither the nation nor the state was fully formed or remains unchanging. It is in constant change. And so I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind and not talk about settler colonialism, the Canadian nation, the Canadian state as already fully formed. They are constantly being reproduced. And so for me, what becomes really important is how does this nation state, this structure, fit into the global structure that is emerging at that particular moment in time? Because we can't understand the present without actually understanding the processes that became institutionalized, the structures that came into place. And my work really focuses on colonialism, empire being at the core, both of the international order, also in the making of the Canadian nation state. And at the core of this order is violence. And for me, it's very crucial that we keep this violence in context all the time as we think about that moment and as we think about this moment. So settler colonialism, for example, genocidal violence remains at its core. More than exclusion, we need to be going beyond the framework of exclusion to see how forms of exclusion as well as inclusion fold in these underlying forms of violence, structures of violence. Certainly the global war on terror that inaugurated the 21st century brings the issue of violence front and center in terms of organizing the global order, in terms of settler colonialism and its genocidal violence, the discovery of the mass graves on the sites of the residential school system, the ongoing issue of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. The campaigns go on. That violence, that gendered sexual violence continues. And so keeping that violence is very crucial to me. Certainly processes of exclusion, discrimination are crucial for us to understand and to contest, but they cannot be the larger framework for understanding this global order. So what are the underlying structures, logics, dynamics that have formed the Canadian nation state? In my own work, I've argued that the Canadian settler colony is a triangulated racial formation. Indigenous peoples were marked for elimination, subjected to genocidal violence. Euro-Americans for incorporation into the nation, for the construction of the nation and its people. Whiteness, of course, was the kind of defining feature in terms of how the nation was formed. And peoples who come from the enslaved, colonized world, whether we call it voluntary migration or forced migration, who are constructed as a threat to the nation state. Labor is required, the recognition is there, yet they remain constant outsiders, perpetual aliens. And so for me, this triangulated formation is a racial formation, and how it continues to reproduce itself at different moments in the juncture in which we now find ourselves becomes really crucial to me. So, because these underlying logics, processes, and forms of violence have created a racial hierarchy, not only within Canada, within North America, but a racial colonial hierarchy that is global in nature. Keeping that racial hierarchy in this kind of global framework is also very crucial to my work, because this racial hierarchy looks different in different sites. People become positioned differently when they cross borders. And yet colonialism and race are global structures which have formed the order that we live in. So how these change, and I look at them through the lens of race, gender, class, sexuality, as social relations, relations of power, but also as identities, as identifications, which construct particular kinds of enmities, particular kinds of affiliations. And so I think it's really important when we think about this violence, and for me, Fanon is crucial in this. Fanon described the violence as not only economic, it's not only possession of land, but it's possession of the historical consciousness of a people. It's violence at the psychic level that is also crucial to the making of settler colonial relations and to the colonial order as an international global order. So for me, the issue of subjectivity becomes really crucial, and tie that to our study of policies, because they work hand in hand. So what I want to do is just take a few minutes. Do I have a few more minutes, Henry? To look at how these foundational logics, which are, in a way, the DNA of the Canadian nation state formation, how they are being presently articulated. And I want to give you a few examples of projects that I'm working on. So the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, it's been mentioned earlier a number of times, anti-Chinese and then anti-Asian racism exploded across North America, other sites as well, on the streets. And some of it, of course, was very deadly. We saw what the deadly consequences were. This kind of racism was confronted by community organizations and by organizing coalitions, anti-racist coalitions. But in my research, I also want to highlight that the anti-Asian racism in the pandemic was also evident in the state's willingness to sacrifice specific sectors of the population, mostly Asian, Black, migrant, and other workers of color working on the front lines of the economy. And most of these workers were concentrated in low-wage sectors, in hospitals, care homes, grocery stores, meatpacking plants, farms, trucking, transportation. They were treated as entirely expendable by the state and by the nation. And I'm really interested in thinking through how during the COVID pandemic, the Canadian nation itself becomes reimagined in the health measures that were introduced for the pandemic. So middle class and professional classes were supported in their homes, turning these into sanctuaries against the pandemic. And what I've argued is that the sacrificial logic ran through the pandemic measures, which demonstrate that certain sectors of the population, including Asian Canadians, Asian Americans, were considered entirely dispensable by the state. And it was this professional, middle-class, elite families which the state treated in these pandemic measures as its nation, as who had to be protected. Another example from my work is the construction of Muslims as a threat to the nation, threat to the security of the Canadian state and nation, as well as the US in the global war on terror. In fact, this soon proceeded into constructing Muslims as a global threat, as a threat to freedom, democracy, to Western civilization, culture. Muslim bans were put into place everywhere. And what I want to emphasize is that in this moment, what we see is a kind of remaking of the Canadian nation and remaking of the kind of, immediate threat that was constructed as facing this nation. The US as well, we can count any kind of number of cases where this construction of Muslims becomes institutionalized in state policy. And what we saw is the legitimation of violence as modality of governance of Muslims wherever they were around the world. And so this issue of violence remains crucial, and that violence is crucial to how the nation state continues to reproduce itself. The immediate enemy might change, but the underlying racial logics, the underlying kind of national logics continue to play themselves out in these particular kinds of ways. So I want to stop there. I've said a lot. I have a lot more to say, and I hope to come back into the conversation, once others have had their turn to kind of, make other points. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for also bringing many themes and tying what I think has really come up in previous two panels, as well as with the speakers already in this panel, and tying them to even more larger structures of empire. So I'm going to throw it back out now to the others to start picking up whatever strands that you've heard from previous panels, but also from each other, and to kind of bring it into some conversation with each other. So I said, unmute yourself as the signal to me that you'd like to be to say something. Anyone? Okay. Maybe I will throw it in the interest of prompting. I think one of the things that has really come up again and again in a recurring way in the previous two panels, and as we think about sort of where we are now, is this conception of a settler colonial futurity, and the ways in which we are still stuck in many ways thinking through those, and whether it is through terms, as Moon Ho was talking about, that are actually drawn right out of colonial vocabularies. Are there other futurities? And I think, Dean, you raised some not just still existent ways of thinking of non-human relations to the land, to where we are in location, like what are ways of thinking and acting that get us out, I think part of the problem of constantly only looking at the structures of oppression and violence is a kind of hopelessness that people can get, is like there's nothing to be done. But I think already Keith and Dean, you've raised alternative ways of thinking. So I just want to throw that out about throwing these alternate ways that already exist for us to kind of think and configure a way forward.
I'll take a stab at the question first. Maui is such an interesting place because at the same time that there's obviously a lot of grief and despair as a result of what has taken place, there's also long been a lot of hope and possibility about what can be changed, given the fact that the last sugar plantation in all of Hawaii closed on Maui fairly recently. And a part of that closure means that that water is now able to go back from mountain to ocean and restore stream flow, and can potentially be reused for the production of taro, right? So on Maui, the largest continuous area of taro production existed in Navai'eha, which is, so if you look at West Maui, Central Maui shares the same mountain range. And through a long fight, through the Water Commission and then a Supreme Court ruling, they were able to get that water to be restored, because water in Hawaii is considered a public trust asset. And so they've restored that water. It's being used again by taro farmers, and they were going to attempt to try to do the same thing in Lahaina. And the water permits were actually due 1 day prior to the start of the fires in Lahaina. Right, and that's actually why the big move by the state to get rid of Kaleo Manuel, who was the head of the Water Commission, who had been doing a lot of this work to restore water to Native communities. As soon as the fire takes place, and as soon as you have this kind of disaster capitalism and state of exception happening, they attempt to remove Kaleo Manuel and put the blame on Kauaula farmers as to the reason why they didn't have water. The reason why there wasn't water and the reason why Lahaina was dry was because of developers, which was making me think a lot about Aiko's work. The developer on Maui bought the land from the previous plantation, bought land that a lot of Kuleana landowners, who are landowners from the 1850s. So this is when Hawaii was a kingdom. They own land through that initial moment when land is being made property. And so the Kuleana landowners basically said that they leased the land to Pioneer Mill, to the plantation. They didn't sell that land. So that wasn't land to be sold to this guy, Peter Martin, in West Maui to begin with. But when Peter Martin is then trying to create his luxury developments, these gentleman estates that are using agricultural land, but saying that they're planting enough things to qualify it as ag land, they're also water banking. So they're holding all of that water for future development, which is what turned the area incredibly dry, right? It was a wetland prior, tons of ulu trees. If you look at any of the photos prior to that beginning of the water bankment, Lahaina was green, it was fairly wet. So in that kind of collision of futures, you see the way that on the one hand, water is being used as a public trust asset, that cannot be commodified, versus you have other folks who are banking on water and making use of water and land in order to establish these developments that are not to the benefit of anyone outside of the rich. But even the wealthy in Hawaii who are buying those gentleman estates are actually renting out those gentleman estates. So no one's actually living in there. And so it's just a really tough moment, but you can see the ways in which Kanaka Uiwi movements are helping to reestablish the infrastructure that can allow for people to live off the land at the same time that the land can be restored to its health. But it's always in collision with other folks who have different ideas as to how to make money off of it.
Thanks, Dean. It's interesting how, going back to something that David Chang mentioned about the sovereignty as a way of understanding who can make decisions about who belongs, and the arrogance, to use his term, of colonial states to be the ones to abrogate and monopolize that power. That's what inclusion and exclusion, immigration statutes, to use the term that was raised by Moon Ho, those are based on that arrogant grasp of those powers. And you're raising again what it would mean to go back, or to at least try to contest with with other ways of thinking about the relationship to the land rather than property and acquisition and exploitation. I just want to throw Aiko, not to put you on the spot, but I thought I saw you making the move towards the microphone. Yeah.
Oh, I don't know about that. But I mean, I would just say that, I mean, I'm just thinking as Dean is speaking, just of the work of Brenna Bandar, you know, the colonial lives of property, and just and also Rob Nichols' work on, you know, theft is property, just that, and particularly in places like British Columbia, how preemption and you know, all these the surveying of the land, how that is, and that constituted the sort of terrain on which property kind of gets established. And then, I mean, just on the question of inclusion, I mean, I was just reading the work of New York scholar Alfred Flores, who writes about, I think Keith probably knows, who writes about Guam and how I was really struck by the Organic Act of 1950 and how that actually made Indigenous Chamorros like citizens, and how actually that legal enfranchisement or inclusion actually expanded the reach of the military apparatus for dispossession, which actually through eminent domain allowed them to actually have a greater access to land. So I was just thinking about all of these contradictions. And as Dean and Keith were speaking, I guess if I can throw something in there, which is maybe extending something that you said to earlier, Henry, which was just, I mean, the connection between Dean and Keith's work is just around the question of allyship and solidarity and how that occurs. And so I actually would like to hear maybe sort of the connections maybe between what's happening, you know, as Keith shows up at this march, and then, you know, how that might connect also to the way that Candace is thinking about allyship.
Keith?
Also, this is a great conversation. It's like there's so many threads and so many opportunities to dialogue with each other. I think on the what's interesting and our panel and looking back and thinking forward, one thing I found over the years is that scholarship doesn't always match what's happening in real time across different communities and constituents. As a matter of fact, most scholarship is behind, right? And so you always have to ask yourself, history for whom and for what? Scholarship for whom and for what and why? And I think what I found helpful is that, you know, I mean, there is all these studies around engaged scholarship and community-based scholarship. And what, if I could crystallize all those debates, it comes down to, you know, whether people self-identify as Asian, Black, Indigenous, etc., is what are their wants and needs in their terms, right? And what is it as public intellectuals, historians, otherwise, how can we navigate those spaces? And I can't speak for Maui and Dean and others, please jump in these different contexts here and there, but you know, it's really a lot of times building all those relationships and getting to know folks and really sharing power and enabling and amplifying folks that are super marginalized in so many ways. And so like in LA, you know, we partnered with Shauna Goman and Shannon Speed and Indigenous Tongva leaders, Cindy, Desiree, all these great folks, right? It started out as a little opportunity to collaborate and talk about what the Tongva want, what do they need, what are their wants and stuff. I mean, one of the things we found out, they need computers to do, you know, libraries for their kids and do his outreach. But all those little things, seemingly little things, had a greater impact. There's now acknowledgement at UCLA, right? I mean, yes, you know, there is a politics around acknowledgement and material resources. I get it, but I want to give you some context. When I first came to UCLA in 2006, there was no acknowledgement. It was straight up disavowal to all Native people in UCLA, right? And so there are direct causal relationships between relationship building, community-based scholarship, privileged folks' ideas and terms, and the slow crawl of that activism, right? around how that's also connected to our own ideas and the things we want to do. And so I feel like, as I think, for the students that are in this panel, one thing I found over the years, because, I'm going to dive a little bit into institutions as colonial systems, is that, most disciplines, don't allow and avow those kinds of opportunities. And I've heard many a senior, junior person say that to the effect, I get punished, right? I shouldn't be doing these things. I think it's a matter of, to be very concrete for the students in the virtual space, that, hey, there are spaces, you have to look out for those people and where those opportunities, right? But yeah, I think it is, it really comes down to building those relationships that really take time. And this whole Samoan project is really slowing my role. I'm really having to really rethink a lot of things too. And that's actually a good thing. Like there's this temporal scape to our scholarship that I think going to the archive, I'm trained as historians, FYI, going to the archives, whatever archives, etc. A lot of us write stories through the archives, but I tell you, writing those stories outside the archives and having and effecting critical social change takes much more sensibilities, takes a lot of time, a lot of care, and a lot of empathy, and a lot of mistakes. And so though, but that's social building, social movement, scholar activism. But yeah, Aiko and folks, it does, there are these spaces, there are these resources, there are these great folks out there. But what I find is always, have the communities, have the grassroots, whether they're Native or otherwise, Asian, otherwise, have them lead the discussions. When I first came to UCLA, I was doing a lot of that. A lot of faculty were like, what the hell are you doing? But I tell you, it works. And it's transformative. It just takes time.
Thanks. Maybe that you've harkened back to something that was really coming up, I think, earlier in the day as well, about these different registers and different levels. The kind of local and the global. I mean, and just in the remarks in this panel, we've been kind of jockeying back and forth up into the really large global imperial registers, but also that I think back to, again, Alice's story just about family and the kinds of genealogies that are different from the genealogies of empire, but are familial genealogies. Who do I belong to in terms of family? Who are my ancestors? What kinds of relationships to each other are built out of that, but also to non-human relations to again, you go back to what Dean introduced for us to think about is, and in a lot of ways, I think right now in British Columbia, we are in a very different place through Keith raised, just acknowledging, that if we are guests and settlers versus those who are indigenous to these places, but also what it means to be a guest. What relationship do we have to those who are hosting us, even if we are uninvited guests? It's amazing how corrosive of the kind of colonial orders that I think Sunera so eloquently explicated earlier, that can be when you start to have to rethink your relationship to, if we're, in our case, Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples who have been here for time immemorial. So I want to throw that because you've raised also, I think, Keith, the cost to scholars in colonial feudal institutions, as Tim called it, the cost to career, the cost to promotion, the cost to your timelines, to evaluation and reward, and yet you're making a very strong argument for doing that work and raising that question of knowledge for whom. I mean, today we've been talking a lot. We've been sharing a lot of knowledge, and in some sense, the knowledge for whom question is one that's good for those who are students and fellow scholars among in our audience. And so I'll throw the question out. I'm going to ask Melanie and Naomi also to pass along some of the questions from the audience to me to pass along to you as we get into the Q&A. But for each of you, like what are, as scholars and as who are you writing for as well, and who are you in your mind as that primary audience for that transformation? Keith, you've eloquently talked about different audience than perhaps peers who are going to peer review our work and things. But I'll throw that out as a kind of way to perhaps as I wait for some of the Q&A questions to come forth.
Can I jump in, Henry?
Please, Sunera, yes.
Yes, I would like to say something about this issue of solidarities and movements. I think if we look at it historically, what brought an end to the policies, the racially, part of the organization of the racial hierarchy in Canada, what brought about a shift in those policies was actually the activism of communities. What brought about shifts in the international order was the anti-colonial movements of the mid-20th century. Those movements were global, they had a global analysis, they worked across borders, they were ground up. And that, I think, is a question for us today. Where are these movements? How are academics who are doing this work actually connected to movements? It's not the scholarship that's going to change the world. Of course, that scholarship is absolutely important. But what are our relationships to movements? Where are these international movements? What do we do in terms of intervening? And one of the things that the institution is doing today, from my experience, and I've just published a kind of edited volume on this, is looking at how this whole equity inclusion project in the university is a counter. It actually is not just, that exclusion or inclusion are kind of liberal reformist politics, but exclusion, equity, inclusion, this is where radical politics are being redirected by the institution. And so the equity measures, affirmative action that we're seeing, indigenizing the economy, indigenizing the academy, I would put it in the same category, are actually being used by the institution, by our institutions where we work, to counter, destroy, derail radical political demands that are coming within the institution, but also movements outside. And one of the biggest challenges we face today is how to deal with this equity agenda, the inclusionary agenda of the university, because I see this as a site where these policies, these practices are actually being formulated, legitimized, and then they move into corporations. Today we have banks talking about their commitment to equity, to decoloniality. What does that mean? And so we work in an incredibly important institution that is at the center of destroying radical politics. And I think that has to be our framework when we ask this question of what space is there in the institution, what does equity do? The university is at the forefront of destroying the radical knowledge, the radical organizing that is coming from certainly some scholars in the university, movements outside the university. So I think it's really crucial that, when we look at the institution in which we are located, it's too easy to say, oh, equity and inclusion is just toothless. It doesn't really accomplish anything. Well, it does accomplish quite a lot in the world. It actually destroys radical politics, radical movements, grassroots initiatives that are also arising within the institution itself.
Thanks, and I think you're bringing back a lot of what Moon Ho discussed as well about the sort of the the neoliberal kind of inclusion, which I think I hear you talking about EDI initiatives as another form of this that really destroys possibilities and alternatives at the same time that it seems to be, quote, inclusive or achieving equity goals. And we have actually, I think Melanie actually is I'm so interested in hearing other panelists' thoughts on how movements are de-radicalized when they become institutionalized. And again, I think a lot of what all of you have been talking about are actually about the need to have those connections with non-university communities, with incarcerated communities, and the kinds of again, I go back to what Keith you opened up our discussions with, is thinking about people who are making alliances that are strategic for their own reasons in kind of countering what's going on. I'm actually talking. I want to hit on John here, who is John. You have a labor organizing past that perhaps others don't know about. But I'm thinking again of the challenging racism in BC project and the challenging racism in Canada that you put the link to. I mean, a lot of this was about trying to create solidarities in your mind with people who perhaps hadn't worked together. And so I don't know if you have made some thoughts on the question of solidarity and allyship, and I would love to hear Dean talk a little bit more about the use of the term ally that you raised and followed up. But John.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, I think, we tried to reach out to some labor folks around when we began doing some of this work in terms of anti-Asian racism and fighting anti-Asian racism. And there was some response, but generally speaking, what became clear in researching 1923 is that there was a radical labor movement, 100 years ago. And we found some, stories that were great in terms of radical labor leaders who refuted anti-Asian racism from that era. But what we saw was how they were purged, right, in the 1920s as well, right? And so that, in terms of state formation, the labor movement was largely incorporated into the state. And as a result, we have the labor movement, organized labor, is an institution that, has the potential and does act as a training ground for some radical thought, but generally speaking, it's very, very conservative in its approach. So I think that, it's an impediment, actually. And I think that, this question of terms of inclusion that Sunera raised is very, very important. And there's the EDI initiatives, but there's also how capitalism is working towards integrating First Nations into the capitalist system, right? So all the developments in terms of LNG, right? The liquid natural gas projects. Well, there are corporations now that are putting huge amounts of money into bringing First Nations, right, through the band councils to support the development of those types of projects. And so we see the power of money, the power of capitalism is like really, is quite incredible. And so I'm hoping that, we do need to embrace radicalism and a radical approach to some of these questions. That's why I raised the issue of racial capitalism. Also, Indigenous thought is really important in terms of offering new ways of thinking about relations amongst people and people's relationships to the earth. Those things are really incredibly important because, as the theories of racial capitalism has made me think, Marxism as a sort of a modality of thought is very, very limited. And so we need to reinvent, ways of approaching these questions that will bring in young people because they reflect their experiences. And unfortunately, the capacity of the labor movement to do that is limited at this time.
Thanks, John. I don't know. Sorry, yeah, I don't know if you wanted to keep on the allyship question or not, but I just want to give you the chance if you did want to.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to maybe think a little bit more about like these ideas of like institutionalizing radical ideas and the ways in which that process can become a detriment to communities who are in movement. Like I definitely think that's a really important point, and I can see so many instances of that happening. I would also say that I think, having taught at NYU and then now moving to the University of Hawaii, I see this public institution having a lot more connection to communities and fields being existent as a result of community struggle. And certain scholars, particularly the Kanaka Wibi scholars, who have made use of this university to kind of steal from the university, the way that Fred Moulton kind of described and Stefano Harney, to build wealth within the community. And I think like a perfect example would just be like Noe Silva, who is my colleague. And I was able to bring her to my class on Thursday, which was a huge treat for myself and the students, because we were able to ask her the story about how she found the Ku'e petitions. So the Ku'e petitions are 38,000 signatures of Kanaka in 1897 who oppose annexation. And the general story prior to the finding of the Ku'e petitions was that after the 1893 overthrow, there were stories of people crying and mourning, but that the general idea was that Hawaiians never did anything to resist. But the story that Noe was able to find was only able to be told because she was at the university and learned Olelo Hawaii to become fluent in the Hawaiian language. And then to go to Washington, D.C. to find the petitions, bring the petitions back, publicize the petitions, put them up so that community people could find their families' names, their kupuna's names, and find that continuity of resistance between their kupuna and themselves now. And it actually opened things up so that the discourse wasn't only federal recognition and kind of nation within nation status, but also the option for independence. I only share that story because I think that's, she tells the story in such a way where it's not like this, she's performing radicalism. She's not performing like the kind of like, she doesn't tell the story in a way that makes her seem like a kind of hero. Like she's like, yeah, I went to the archive and this pamphlet was given to me and it had a picture of the petitions and I thought, this is interesting, so I should go check out the petitions. And I brought back the petitions. I just want to say that I think it's just, there's so many different kinds of institutions, so many different kinds of scholars, and so many different ways of connecting to community. Noelani Kaupua teaches in this department as well. She helped found a Hawaiian charter school that uses their school to teach their students in Holelo, Hawaii, in the Hawaiian language, how to grow and prepare their own food. They reestablished a taro farm. They reestablished water rights. They teach their students how to testify in opposition to things in the legislature. So I think there are so many different ways of being a scholar, and there are definite ways of forms of scholarship that are extractive. But I also do think that there are, at least since I've been here, and I don't want to like romanticize because we don't have any resources and like we're constantly kind of inundated with these bureaucratic instructions to justify our existence all the time. But I would say that it's such a different place from working at the place that I worked at previously. And there's such a different commitment to community given the gravity of the situation here. So the majority of the people who resisted and chained themselves to the cattle grate, blocking the telescope equipment from going up to Mauna Kea, were faculty from the University of Hawaii. So I just think that a general condemnation against institutions and radicalism to me is not useful. And I understand the critique, but I would also say that this is an important space. It's an important space to steal from the university and resources to give to communities. And how you go about doing that, you might have mistakes and you might have failures, but I think the commitment is existent. And that gives me some hope.
Beautifully said, Dean. Thank you for eloquently also, I think, capturing what I think a lot of the people actually in these three panels have been trying to do, is is to imagine themselves as kind of redistributing the wealth that are sitting at universities and gathered by universities and trafficking in that kind of knowledge and but then trying to move them out to other people. So thanks, Dean. I think of also something that came up in the first panel, which is the use of archives, which you so eloquently talked about. That there are things in there that that they're originally weaponized, for colonial aims, but access to those records can be used in other ways. I mean, the irony to me of surveillance is that you can find more information about the Chinese, in the United States and Canada in the late 19th, 20th century. There's files, there's reams and reams of surveillance files and folders, and yet you can go to those and use them in ways that they weren't intended for. And I think that is one of the ironies of the Colonial Archive. There's silences that came up, I think, in the first panel as well. And but if you're attentive to as I think Laura Matacoro so eloquently put, if you're attentive to those silences and you try to understand, as Tim Stanley also, I think, go to those silences, go to the ways in which things weren't intended to use them in different purposes, I think is one of the things I take out of your story, Dean, of using them to actually counteract what they were originally meant to create. So perhaps some messages of hope of actually using positions within institutions such as the university. Again, this is maybe as much for some of the people out there who are wondering whether the complicity of being in an institution is somehow something that should make you give up, versus trying to work in those spaces in different ways. So thank you for that, Dean, and as well as others. We have a couple minutes just to I don't know if there's any other things that any of you want to add to the conversation that you haven't had a chance to say already. Just give you want to give everyone that chance. Michael, yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna maybe add to the question about institutionalization, which is always very fraught, because I've spent the last 6 years creating a department of critical race and political economy. And I think that it's, caused us to reflect a lot about, what the critical is in that frame. And it is precisely because of to call attention to the dangers of institutionalization, which many of us have experienced within maybe an ethnic studies paradigm or something like that. But also thinking too about what Olufemi Taiwo calls like elite capture, and how identity politics have been kind of mobilized in really terrible ways, and so things have been kind of reduced to a kind of DEI paradigm. And maybe just, I think one of the goals, by emphasizing something that might feel like a little bit old school around political economy is maybe this connects to John's point about racial capitalism, which is something that I'm studying. It's probably what I would say that I study probably the most. And just to sort of to teach students to understand, because this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but to understand that this is political economy, that it's constantly moving, and actually, as I will out myself as a diehard Marxist, that actually, Marx does have a lot to teach us about social relation, that, capital is not a thing, but a social relation between people that is mediated through things. So what does it mean in an ecological context? How do we understand? How does it change our modes of analysis? And so these are some of the tools and methods, I think, that can be helpful in sort of keeping our eye on what's critical about critical race and political economy. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Echo. Sunera.
Yes, I would just like to say that I think that it's really important for critical scholars to be connected to movement politics. I just think it's really, one of the things that the neoliberal university has really done very successfully is to individualize one's kind of certainly the reward system, the promotion system, but also this idea that somehow one's individual intention is enough. And I think that it's such a moment of grave crisis that building movements and the active involvement of not only academics, but intellectuals of any sort, whether they're based in the community, whether in the academy, this work isn't being done. Knowledge isn't being produced only in the university. That those linkages are absolutely crucial. And I think it's really important that they are cross-racial, that they're cross-national, that they're global, both in terms of how we're thinking about this change. I think one of the things that also neoliberalism has done so effectively is to trap us all in thinking through the categories of the nation state. And I think it's really important that academics are also working across borders and not within the confines of kind of privileging the nation state. Thanks.
Thanks, Sunera. And I wish we could capture that as the rationale for today's actually symposium in a lot of ways, to bring together people from various locations and sites together. Again, I want to give any others sort of, I don't want to call them last words, but additional insights that you want to raise. If not, I think that was a wonderfully eloquent way to draw things together. So our thanks, Sunera. We're going to draw this to a close, and they're supposed to be in the schedule kind of closing remarks. And I just wanted to invite Tak Fujitani to join us and to kind of help close. I think the most important way to start a closing is to thank everyone who has spent their time. I know that many of you prepared your remarks and took part in sessions, to discussions, even before today's discussions. And so our thanks to all the panelists for again generously spending your time on a weekend with us, to think with us, to speak and talk and with each other. So our biggest heartfelt gratitude to all the panelists and speakers. I want to thank Naomi, Louis, and Melanie Eng, because as the panelists know, they were the ones who really reached out, cajoled, invited, kept on you about bios, and then so that really hard work of bringing people together for a conversation. So our big thanks to both of them. They're again, for those who don't know and haven't seen the bios for them, that Naomi recently completed her master's here at UBC, and Melanie is on her way to very close to finishing, we hope, her PhD at the University of Toronto, and so they'll be joining, we hope, a broader set of practices in terms of not just creating knowledge, but I think where to me, one of the things that I saw as a continual theme that I just want to maybe amplify and echo before passing on to Tak for some of his thoughts is it seems to me that there's a historical doctrine of discovery that justified from the minds of those who are of stealing indigenous land and territory, and by mapping and saying this, we've discovered it, so it's ours. It still seems that there is an academic form of that doctrine of discovery, which is that finding out someone else's knowledge somehow is self-justified for some people as being something to reward. And what we've heard, I think, again and again in the three panels are people really pushing for ways in which knowledges are mobilized, shared, brought into relationship with each other, but with people, and with in ways that are actually meant to counter, I think, the kind of that neoliberal, colonial, feudal institutional order of universities. And so we hope that today the kind of discussions that those of you have joined us have been a part of, listened to, and thank you to all of those who dropped comments and shared links and things in the chat. That this is actually also hopefully a way of creating a different set of practices where this is not about publishing an article and saying I discovered something, and that doctrine of discovery of then counting how many research publications are required for promotion, and something that is we've all struggled against in terms of as those of you who work with communities closely, those who have protected. And going back to again something that came up with Alice making some things it's okay, it doesn't have to be shared. This is a set of knowledges that belongs to these people, and the idea of collecting in this rapacious, extractive, exploitative way the knowledges that people have. I think we are also need to be careful even in this moment not to think that I've heard too much of indigenous ways of knowing as if this is another extraction where we're going to go and look for our salvation by again going and finding knowledge systems and approaches that again are valued now as a form of salvation. So thanks again to everyone as a way to close. I'm going to pass it on to Tak for any kinds of
yeah. Thank you, Henry. I also want to thank Melanie and Naomi, Jennifer. I won't repeat all of this laudatory remarks, but I also want to add Henry for taking the time and using his brain power to help us through this whole process and organize in ways that we felt would be useful at this moment in time. Listening and jotting notes throughout the day, I just felt like we had an amazingly rich conversation, despite the limitation of time that we had. Most people could have talked, for hours independently, and yet there was some real conversation going on, I think, not only within the panels, but between the different panels. So the conversation was continuing throughout the day. I have to say that I really, especially was moved by the different statements about the possibilities of hope within our institutions and the ways that these possibilities are being carried out by different people who are away from the centers of power. So for me, I feel a certain twinge of guilt as I hear all the great things that are being done on the ground. As for people like me within the university, I really agree that we need to not simply dismiss the university, but rather take advantages of the contradictions of liberalism and also humanism, that we need to approach those kinds of ideologies as not airtight, but that we can find some kind of way of breaking through. So I was, really also very much taken by Dean's statement about this importance of rethinking the relationship between the human and the non-human, and for reasons of environmental responsibility, and also because humanism is very much bound up with racism. So I thought, these things are ways that we can get through. Well, we will never get through probably, but we can try to make our way through this kind of what seems like such horrible things happening on the ground throughout the world, but from which most of us are actually very much protected. I just want to also share one anecdote, which is that, I'm primarily a historian of Japan. So I would teach my students all these things that I thought was responsible, like imperialism and nationalism and racism, sexism, exploitation of labor, all of that stuff. And one day, one of my students asked, Professor Fujitani, did anything good happen in Japan in the last 2 centuries? And I really didn't know what to say. But I said, really, no, not much, really. And but of course, it's a very serious question to be raised. And that moment, I really felt like, you know, there's something to, it may sound corny, but we need to have hope for ourselves as well as the people that we teach and the people that we interact with. I don't want to go on and on, but I also want to say that, you know, with regard to the issue of identity politics that was raised just briefly, I find too often students who are looking for that hope among from people who they can identify racially or from national origin or culturally and so forth. And I don't there's some, you know, benefit to that, obviously, as a step, but it's also can be quite debilitating. And you need to, you know, we need to find ways outside. So lately, for me, I've been very much interested in Du Bois and his engagement with Asia as a place of hope. And not that he did all the things right, but that what can we extract from his hopefulness about the possibilities of Japan as a racialized nation. Of course, he failed miserably on several points, including not being able to critique the Japanese empire. But, you know, we can revisit these moments and see what possibilities that existed that didn't really pan out. So one final thought is also that, you know, so many of the students that I teach, I have taught over, you know, almost half a lifetime actually by now, have experienced Japanese colonialism more directly than other colonialisms, or they imagine that to be the case, or occupations or violence. Could be Chinese students who talk about, you know, the Nanjing massacre, or Korean students who talk about the comfort women issue and so forth. And yet the textbooks that we have, general textbooks about colonialism and imperialism, don't really engage with the Japanese empire, or, you know, and so what in my teaching about it, I try to point out that actually, although we would want to exceptionalize the Japanese case, it's just one among the different empires. So don't take this criticism of the Japanese empire as a validation for your own empire, where you are now or where you come from. So anyway, if there had been more time, I would like to talk about some differences as well as some local issues having to do with Japan as a place that was not racialized as white, but was an empire as well, and the sort of differences that generated. And I would also say that, you know, just again, I said final note once already, but again, I would say that even such a thing as internment of Japanese Canadians and Japanese Americans would probably not have happened in the way it did unless Japan was an empire, and that the European and American Canadian empires were competing with Japan as empires. But we always think of internment as a kind of national issue that's about racism in the nation. So this is another possibility, I think, of exploring outside the box in this kind of transnational, you know, Trans-Pacific. I know there's problems with, you know, some people's feelings about Trans-Pacific, but if we center really the Pacific in many ways that people have done today, and then think in and through it to the metropolitan empires, I think that could also be quite useful and helpful. But again, I think we're at the end of the time, so I want to, aren't we, Henry? I think
I believe we are at the end of the time, and I'm going to I know that some folks are going to be moving over to a final debrief, and so again, I wanted to. This is going to be this is recorded and also be it'll be posted, and so I want to again thank everyone who's worked so hard, again, especially Naomi and Melanie, and thank Tak Fujitani for bringing the support of again his institution and the center that he director at the University of Toronto, as well as again Jenny Liu, who on our end, who did so much work to provide the tech infrastructure. So thanks to everyone, and again, we will hopefully, this is just the beginning of more conversations. Thank you.
Thank you from me as well. Goodbye.